Hello and welcome to another episode of Salute Ukraine. I'm Lily.
And I'm Chris.
How are you doing, Chris?
I've been a little tired, but I think it's because of the change of the seasons, you know? It's like that time of the year where everything happens, but nothing happens at the same time while we're waiting for summer. How have you been?
I've been good. I've been enjoying the 1 week of good New York weather as it transitions from being really cold to really hot. So I'm happy.
Yeah, this is like peak let's get outside weather.
First I want to hear from your perspective. I know you chat politics with your friends, with your husband. What's the word? What are people saying in your kind of circle of friends, in your internet feed? What's the algorithm showing you? What's going on with Ukraine?
The algorithm is showing me, because of my interest in fashion, of course, the algorithm was like, oh, did you see at the coronation that our Joe Biden was wearing a yellow dress, and the First Lady of Ukraine was wearing a blue dress, and they were representing the Ukrainian flag, which I thought was like beautiful and chic and the moment, as it were. My husband and I, he's very political, and I feel like I'm a little less political than him, but we do have these discussions, and I have been kind of like breadcrumbing him into this Ukraine conversation, ironically, because usually it's the opposite way around, where he's trying to talk to me about different political things, and I'm like, whatever. Mm-hmm. But in this instance, I've been like, because the discussion centers around race a lot. It centers around like the politics of Eastern Europe are not generally like seem tolerant of people of my complexion. So it's hard to move him towards that direction. But I have been trying to breadcrumb him and say, like, look, this is about like the geopolitics of like the world and how the future of the world is going to be. So it's something that we should be engaging in as Americans, especially since we're always engaging in things that he feels like we shouldn't be engaging in. But this is something that's important. And I think and Russia is a world power, right? And if a world power is doing something that violates people's human rights, it's something that everybody should be paying attention to.
I think so, but his feelings about race and his place in Eastern Europe and relationship to it from a racial perspective, I think is also important. I think we should talk a little bit more about that. So what is the reluctance there, or the concern about supporting Ukraine from a perspective like that?
I think the reluctance comes from some of the news that we saw during the beginning of the war, where people of African descent living in Ukraine or visiting Ukraine or studying in Ukraine were being denied access to like evacuation trains out of some of the the bombed areas. And it seemed like the Ukrainian people were enacting some colorism, racism, whatever you want to call the type of like skin-based discrimination that happens to a lot of people of color around the world. And so a lot of my friends are very reticent in entering a conversation where we feel like we're not wanted. Like if I lived in Ukraine, how would I be treated? And if I fight for like the liberation of Ukraine, does that mean I'm fighting for the liberation of an oppressor?
Yeah, I feel like anyone who's arguing for Ukraine at least deserves to have a nice trip thereafter. And if you feel like, hey, I might not be treated fairly, I think it's going to be hard to muster a lot of enthusiasm for the cause.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult because we do sometimes have to take the moral high ground. And it's hard when you feel like you're already in a marginalized category to think about or be vocal about other people, because you're like, they wouldn't do the same for me. But I think that we have to maybe, you have to admit that those feelings are there and that those are realities, right? That racism is a reality all over the planet, but also that like Russia is not letting Russia take over Ukraine is not going to solve the racism problem if there is a huge one in Ukraine.
I think that would take us a lot farther from solving that problem.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to just ask, how bad is racism in Ukraine? I'm just going to take it for granted that racism exists everywhere on this planet, and there is racism in Ukraine, and I'm not going to clutch, my pearls about this. I think it's such a difficult comparison to make to the United States because, United States is a colonial society. We've had this racial system in place, the traditional being white, black, and indigenous for hundreds of years. It's been made a little more complex with the addition of Latinos and Asians, but the racial system is still very salient in the United States in a lot of ways, and we're just not going to find something like that in Ukraine. Ukraine is not a colonial society. It just doesn't have our history at all. But there is like global anti-Blackness, right? There's like a global issue here separate from the dynamics in the Americas. So I think in terms of like, how bad is it? I have absolutely no idea.
And neither do I.
I don't really have any of the evidence that I would need to say it's this bad or that bad or here is where it is. I can mention some things that people point to. One is that Ukraine does not have the anti-Muslim immigrant past of Poland and Hungary. I mean, Hungary, it's like they're just beating a dead horse. I'll be flipping through, YouTube videos, and I'll see yet again Hungarian politicians making the same arguments. Oh, these refugees are going through all these safe countries to come to Hungary, and they don't. Okay, it's like I've heard this argument over and over and over and over for the last, 10 years or whatever it's been. And it's like, I'm not saying you're wrong. It is a kind of new development of large migrations from conflict zones that cross multiple, countries not in conflict in order to reach a good job market. And I understand that, and we should be able to talk about it openly, but Hungary is not alone in dealing with this. Every country in Europe is dealing with this, and some in the Middle East as well. And to hear them just emphatically make this claim separately from other European countries over and over, I think it absolutely cries racism. And the intensity of the opposition and how much that regime in Hungary has staked its own position with the Hungarian public on this premise of we're going to keep migrants out. I don't have any way to interpret that other than intense xenophobia, with racism being a big driver. I think Poland has a lesser version of that. They've not been as hardcore, but pretty strong. I remember the Polish president a few years ago, who's the head of state, not the head of government. So this is supposed to be the kind of wiser, above it all, big picture person, not the day-to-day politics person, being very openly in this kind of fatherly way to the Polish public of, what I would describe as cultural racism, the argument that somebody else's culture is so different that we can never live with them in a free society. It just can't work because of cultural differences. And he was making that argument proudly, vocally. He also tied it into kind of Polish Soviet history, where he talked about communist internationalism and cosmopolitanism only really being for people of similar cultural backgrounds.
Interesting.
And, people from Syria, they're way out, they're right out, in this argument. So I think it's absolutely fair to describe Poland and Hungary in these kinds of negative terms. I think they've earned it. I've had conversations with people from Poland in particular where they got really upset when I described their government as racist or these policies as racist. It almost feels to me like people with that point of view, they like being in the EU for certain reasons. They like the economic benefits, they like the subsidies, they like the ability to travel to Western Europe, they like the prestige and the social status of having a passport that's part of the EU. But then when it comes to certain things in inclusion, multiculturalism, human rights, democracy, then again, this way of thinking, which is not everyone in any particular country, but in this populist way of thinking, that goes too far. Mm. They want the money, they want the subsidies, they want the passport, they want the travel and the cultural exchange with Western Europe. And they do not want to have to recognize or celebrate the cultures of foreigners. They don't want to look at their own racial identity, their national identity. This goes too far.
Yeah, it's kind of like, to me, a way of taking advantage of other people's work to be able to be part of the EU, while also it's like you're conservative at home but liberal abroad type of situation, where it's like the things that you're benefiting from come from these cultures or countries or communities trying very hard to uphold ideas of multiculturalism. And, it's interesting when you're talking about the idea of like Poland not liking immigrants. And I feel like in like a flipped way, Britain kind of treats Polish people the same. And we would think that our oppression helps us learn not to, mirror certain behaviors, but sometimes it has the opposite effect on us as people and as cultures and as governments too, where it's like you yourself become just as xenophobic as the people, as like you're being treated that way in another place. And I think I want to give people the benefit of the doubt of like their ignorance. Maybe they're not very, they don't spend a lot of time learning about other cultures because they don't want to, but also because maybe that information is not available to them. I try to give people that type of benefit of the doubt. But from listening to you and from like, watching whatever little news that I get, it's interesting to see that the racism or xenophobia problem is not maybe a Ukrainian issue. One can say maybe it's an Eastern European issue. And in that way, a Soviet issue, yeah, and in that way, like a global issue. But it's interesting that particular part of Europe. Not to say we're not gonna, we can't talk about Swedish nationalism or nationalism other places in Western Europe, but it's particularly strong in those Soviet blocs. Ironically, when we watched Russian propaganda last time, Russia sees itself as like not part of this xenophobic idea, not part of propagating this idea, which I find so interesting. And I think that's something we will talk about throughout these podcasts.
Well, let's talk about it, because you're mentioning Eastern Europe, and I said maybe it's a post-Soviet issue. First, let's start with, but there's racism in Sweden and the UK and the US. I want to put that aside. I just don't think that that's a good faith argument, because these issues are openly and vocally discussed constantly in the United States, in the UK, in Sweden. And these are also countries with immigration policies where huge numbers of people are entering every year. So not at all to say that's not an important conversation. It's just one that's happening all the time. And I think it's just fundamentally bad faith when people bring it up, because Poland does not view itself as a multicultural country. It doesn't want immigration from a lot of the world. And yeah, I think we need to have the conversation separately about a country like that. Now, you mentioned like Russia not seeing itself as part of racism. And I think we should talk about Russian anti-racism. And this is a real thing. And I think by talking about Russian anti-racism, we'll understand something about Russian racism. So Russian anti-racism, I'm going to talk about basically two kind of forms of it. One is the old Soviet form, which is still quite influential, and it argues that anything that happens that appears to be about race is really about class, and it's about different national cultures. So internationalism in the Soviet political context was supposed to allow people from different cultures to cooperate. I think that what that Polish president said about internationalism being basically only for people in the Soviet Union or in the Warsaw Pact countries is correct. So there's limits to what that internationalism meant. We saw a lot of racism by the 80s, really, in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union when there was immigration and visiting students, in particular from Africa. And the racism was already quite established and prevalent by the 80s. Officially, ideologically, it couldn't exist. And this is the situation they ran into in Afghanistan because their kind of Marxist theory said that no one would ever turn down a communist revolution. So it was very hard for them to believe that they were facing a struggle for national liberation in Afghanistan. But the same thing kind of happened on race, where it was clear, it was widespread. There were already famous incidents by the 80s of racist violence, but the Soviet authorities could basically do nothing with that. Then the kind of evolution of Russian anti-racism is to what we have today. So if you watch videos of Putin, and we watch a lot of Russian propaganda, you'll see different kind of comments where he says things, always speaking to a white Russian audience, an ethnic Russian audience. That's always the presumed we. The presumed kind of default audience is definitely an ethnic Russian. And they'll say things like, these people aren't one bit different from you, speaking of minorities in Russia. And I think it's disingenuous. That's how I view it, because I think Russian anti-racism is fundamentally to prop up imperial ideology, to say, no, there's no problem that only 70% of people who are Russian citizens actually identify as Russian. Not at all. We're all part of the Russian world. This is its own kind of multicultural doppelganger that they have there. But it really doesn't amount to anything. You're not allowed to make arguments from a racial perspective. You're not allowed to talk about racism or discrimination. Ethnic Russians are allowed to openly discriminate, as we've seen in like job ads and things like that. So that's part of it. It's really a kind of Russian supremacy. But the official ideology is that, no, we're all brought together as equals in the Russian world. So it's very similar to the old Soviet idea, but it's ultimately skin deep. It in no way can challenge the ethnic Russian centrality of the state, nor can it be used to fight discrimination. And from my viewpoint, that's exactly what we have in Poland and Hungary, is this skin deep, this very thin layer of tolerance that barely concedes a kind of racist chauvinism right below the surface.
And I think it's ironic when we do talk about this, the Russian propaganda, that when Russia compares itself to the West, then it flips the racism conversation around, where it says that white people in the West are being oppressed because they have to have conversations about race. And in Russia, you're free because you don't have to have those certain conversations, and you don't get to bring it to the forefront because everybody is equal. by everybody, it's the dominant group is equal.
Right.
Yeah, which is everybody's Russian, so we don't have that problem.
Your family's from Haiti, right?
Yes, and so am I. I was born there.
Oh, yeah, yeah, right. So what's the nationalism like there? Does it have like a strong racial component? Is it civic? What's national identity like in Haiti?
It does have a strong racial component. After the Haitian Revolution, Dessalines, the president, said that every single person born in Haiti, no matter what how they genetically look, is considered Black. That was a big part of a big national push to be recognized as Haitian, is to be Black. Like, it means the same thing.
I don't follow that. Why is that an appealing idea?
So the chattel slavery is based on a hierarchical system, a colonial system of basically saying that Black people are inferior to whites, right? Mm-hmm. So when the revolution happened, even though Haitian society was basically like white planters, Black enslaved people, and then their children were kind of like running the country in some ways. Sometimes these white plantation owners would have biracial children that they would send abroad to be educated. And in large part, a lot of the high class in Haiti became basically whites and mixed people. So when the revolution happened, the idea was to turn the system on its head so that Blacks became the powerful ones, the ones in charge. And then, and because a large part of like Haitian upper society was mixed race, there was this idea of like just erase the whiteness by just calling everybody Black. So even if you were to have like a white ancestor, by whatever means it came about, usually brutal means it came about, the revolution meant that Haiti got to restart with everybody being Black. And being Black means being superior because it upended the previous system.
Is that in a assimilative approach where they're saying, okay, granted, there's this upper class mulatto population, but in time we're all Black, we're all gonna, is the idea here to assimilate the mulatto minority?
Yes. And the idea is to assimilate them, and the idea is that to assimilate the whole island. So eventually Dessalines did actually take over the republic, the part that is now the Dominican Republic, where the Spanish were controlling everything, and also wanted them, like the Dominican side, to be considered as Black, and which ironically is probably one of the reasons why Haiti is not united today, because that side of the island was definitely against that ideology. Haiti does have still today a very rigid colonial structure, where usually people of lighter skin, even if everybody's Black, that idea has not really been upheld, and people who are lighter skin are seen as better or superior, just like a lot of places in the world. And and I think that Haiti has tried to over its history, tried to do this thing where it appends. So we had the Noirist movement in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, which is where a lot of like Black power concepts around the world comes from, some people argue, where the Haitian darker skinned middle class arose, and they decided that this idea of a biracial or mulatto or multiracial class dominating the country was inappropriate, it was racist, and they tried to take over and append their power. So
can I ask you about that?
Yes, you can.
So would I be right in thinking that part of the everyone is Black philosophy was trying to mask the concentration of wealth and power of the mulatto minority by saying, well, we're all Black, there is no concentrated power on racial lines?
I think that that's part of the goal, but I think the other goal is to sever ties with Europe. Because a big part of like the biracial and mulatto class is that a lot of times they will have family members who are part of European royalty, especially French royalty. If your great grandfather owned the plantation in Haiti, which was one of the most prosperous plantation systems in the world before the revolution, your family could still be around in France. And there are a lot of mulatto people who have had power in Haitian culture, who have family in Europe, who continue to have family in Europe, and who live abroad or send their children to study abroad at European institutions. And the Noirist movement was trying to say, hey, like, let's sever our ties with Europe. Let's like make a national identity that teaches its children that Black is the ultimate here in Haiti. This is why you'll see like castles in Haiti and you're like, wow, how did this happen? It's just this idea of like reflecting Europe, but severing ties with Europe. And I think was the goal. But even still today, right? This idea, this is a global idea that like lighter skin is fairer is better. And that's something that we have even in the national Haitian context of like being sensitive to the idea that like everyone is Haitian, no matter what their race is, can also butt against the idea that like there is a real reality of race in the colonial system, right? And I think that's something that, you know, post chattel slavery, especially Black-white, the relations in that slavery system, it's difficult to ever erase or to deal with, I think.
Absolutely, because this happened at the time of the formation of the national identity. It's not going to be easy to modify that. Am I right in guessing that your family may have had one approach to Haitian national identity and a different one to American? Because my family is also like that. You know, if we talk about Israeli politics versus American politics, on the American side, I think there's the desire for minority rights and integration and pluralism and multiculturalism to a degree. But then back home, slightly different approach. Does that happen with Haiti?
Absolutely. And yeah. And I think that it's very hard for people to understand, or maybe to give up their privilege, or not to use those buzzwords, but to really, sometimes an idea abroad is more beneficial for you than when it is at home. Back to what we were talking about between the Polish-British conversation, where as we're living in America, it's all about like trying to get Black rights and trying to be able to be afforded the same opportunities as everyone else. But then when I'm at home, my mother would give me skin bleaching cream, you know? And it's just like one of those situations where it's like, should I be proud of myself as a Black woman in America, or should I feel shame that my skin doesn't mark me as closer to like the one white ancestor I have, right? And so these conversations do hit home for me, because sometimes when we're talking about racism, it's very complicated and confusing. And when we're talking about national identity and racism and xenophobia, right? It's also very complicated, because especially now that we live in nation states, they are sometimes your cultural identity. So Haiti is a country that was made fusing like, you know, the cultures of both the oppressor and the oppressed, and all this other and all the historical realities of all the people that have migrated there over the hundreds of years that it's existed. And sometimes I'm like, for instance, this is like a very weird example, but there's like a Haitian restaurant in my neighborhood in Flatbush. I live in a Haitian neighborhood in New York City, and it's becoming very popular. And there's a part of me that's like, why do they have to Americanize the food? Why do they have to Americanize the culture for assimilation? We don't need to be assimilated. While I am a woman who lives in America, and I'm very Americanized when I'm around other Haitian people. Like, they're like, oh my God, what is wrong with you, right? But it's still, there's that part of me that's like, this belongs to me. This is mine. This is ours. We don't have to share with other people. When that's not, I don't know where that feeling comes from, but yeah, I still feel that sense of nationalism, where my American nationalism is very much like, we're America, we're all about human rights, we share cultural exchange, that liberal globalism that I love so much. And then there's the Haitian part of me that's like, Haiti is for me only, and for nobody else.
So I think for a country like Haiti, it has a lot of struggles. I believe it's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. So these problems, if they are in fact problems, they're not really topical. Not a lot of people are trying to immigrate to Haiti right now. I think when it comes to like an EU country like Poland or Hungary, the issue becomes a lot more serious. Because I think from, my American, my Western perspective, there's far worse things happening in the world, right? But we're not okay with that in the West. Most countries do not have anything like a fair immigration policy in the old world. Like, even if you're born there, you can't become a citizen usually in the old world. And, for countries that not a lot of people are moving to, whatever. But when it's somewhere that also wants to be seen as a democracy and a Western modern country, that's where the problem comes in. And that's where I see the problem for Poland or Hungary. So Hungary is not a democratic country anymore. The European Parliament voted and said that it was an electoral autocracy. So congratulations, EU. There's now one non-democratic member of a supposedly democratic bloc. And then Poland's got one foot in and one foot out. They have a spat right now with Brussels and the European Commission, but they haven't crossed a line yet that I think many people are saying they're not really a democracy. Also, this war in Ukraine is probably leading to the democratic foot being cemented because there's so much American and European interest in Poland right now. But still, let's not be shy of saying things that need to be said. Is Hungary a racist country? Yes, I think that is a very fair description. I think its rhetoric is extremely racist from the government, proudly xenophobic and racist. And then the policy is also extremely racist on anything touching race or immigration or national identity. For Poland, I definitely think so. I think their anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish rhetoric is very clear. The policy is relatively clear that they don't want Muslim migrants. The policy is relatively clear that they don't want Jewish people expressing Jewish opinions. So I think it's a little more mixed with Poland, but I definitely think so. But now, to get back to your husband's reticence on Ukraine, I think you and I have been very open. I don't think we've engaged in any apologetics or whataboutism. But coming back to Ukraine, I don't think that's really fair to put them in the same bucket. I just do not think that that's fair. First of all, I'd say, where is this long tradition of racist rhetoric coming out of Ukraine? Because for Poland and for Hungary, I can point you to videos where they're proudly on videotape going on and on and on about how they don't want any immigrants or refugees from Syria. I don't really have that for Ukraine. The other thing is that Poland has developed for itself, and so has Hungary, chauvinistic identities. They're constantly engaged in provocations against their own neighbors. Poland engaged in provocations against Ukraine around history and different national memory kind of issues. when it comes to Ukraine, I don't see that chauvinistic identity. I haven't seen any attempt to make, ethnic Ukrainians central to the state. I think Ukraine's only now figuring out what that all means. I see much more of a civic and multicultural and tolerant environment. I think Ukraine's also much more secular than Poland. I think Catholicism gets added to the ethnic identity and creates this kind of toxic mix that we have an ethnic religion. And I think that has to do with their path out of the Soviet Union and the Solidarity movement in the 80s. But I just don't see that in Ukraine. And people keep talking about this one incident that happened early in the war as the country was getting invaded, as there was chaos at a border where there were two countries involved. And I talked about this in depth with Yaroslav, and I'm talking about it with you, but I guess my response is to people who don't want to support Ukraine based on race is this. I'm not dismissing your concern, I'm not minimizing your concern, and I'm not trying to redirect it to some other issue. But I do want evidence. And I think pointing back to this same incident over and over that happened at the beginning of the war, that's just not persuasive to me. It's just not. And I would love for it to be persuasive. And if someone wants to make a stronger case that we need to really put racial politics at the center of how we think about Ukraine, I'm open to that. But the thing is, I don't see a lot of evidence for that perspective, and I also see tons for the multicultural Ukraine. Pretty much everything coming out of Zelensky's mouth, out of the government's mouth. I follow Ukrainian civil society, so the leading newspapers and podcasts and all that kind of thing. I don't see it. If there's some toxic, ethnic, racist nationalism right under the covers for Ukraine, someone's going to need to explain it to me better, because I see it in Poland, I see it in Hungary, I see it in Russia, I see it in so many countries in this region, and I just don't see Ukraine being on this path. So I have to ask, is there anything else that your husband or friends of yours have brought up to you? Because for me, it's always that one incident at the border.
I think in the instance of me discussing it with people around me and people on the internet, I think the other thing is there is this sense of like there is a Nazi wing in the Ukrainian history, and that is also a point of concern for people.
And where's this coming from? Is it like Jewish friends, Black friends? Who's making this point to you usually?
I think it's just usually generally anyone who's on the left that wants to engage in the Ukrainian conversation. Mm-hmm. At this point, personally, not to say that it doesn't matter to me, but it's sometimes I'm like, is this Russian propaganda? ? And I feel like personally, I don't have as much information about it to really have a real opinion. So I'm not really that engaged in the conversation. Not to say that I don't want to be engaged, but there's a lot of things that I'm not really sure about, a lot of facts that I'm not really sure about. But there's also that concern that like, one, that incident, and two, the fact that like, there's Nazis in Ukraine.
Okay, so we covered the first half, and now let's jump into Nazis. So, where to even begin with this? I guess I'm sympathetic to the first thing we talked about, what happened at the borders and concern over xenophobia in Eastern Europe. Because one, there is a problem with xenophobia in Europe generally, and Eastern Europe has its own flavor of it, which can be really ugly and strong at times. And also, not being a person of color myself, I just kind of really want to make sure I'm giving it a fair hearing and making sure I'm understanding the details. When it comes to this whole Ukraine Nazi accusation, the situation's different. One, I'm Jewish and I feel very invested in not supporting Nazis. And I do know about this subject. To give you my take, yes, it's Russian propaganda. This works with so little that I find it hard to even give it a fair hearing. Now, we can talk about World War II, and we'll get there for sure, but let's talk about the full sum of all evidence I'm aware of for quote-unquote Nazis in Ukraine. First is that there are Nazis in Ukraine. Like in every country, there are some racist weirdos. And just to give you a sense of this, there were also Nazis in Israel. Believe it or not, there was actually a group of youth from the former Soviet Union who were very marginally Jewish, one grandparent type situation. They immigrated to Israel. I guess they didn't like what they saw, and there were, in fact, Nazis in Israel who were actually classified as Jewish or immigrated under Jewish rules. There are in the United States, in the UK, in Germany. I mean, you are not going to find a country, Russia, Poland, etc. So I think that side of it, that there's literally been like films made of like, you know, racist music scene and stuff in Ukraine. I'm not even willing to listen to that. I think we need to completely throw that argument out as in bad faith and meaningless. Now, more broadly, people have talked about the Azov movement. Are you familiar with the Azov movement?
No, not really.
This is essentially Ukrainian ethnic nationalism. This is the kind of toxic strain of Ukrainian nationalism that's very blood and soil, doesn't like Jews, doesn't quite find room enough in the national identity for Jews. So I think the Azov movement is the racist populism of Ukraine. Here we're starting to approach a more fair and good faith argument because all Western countries need to deal with this because they have results in politics, right? There's the Sweden Democrats, there's Alternative for Germany, there's the British Independence Party, here we have the alt-right, you know, on and on. These things do exist, it's not fake. But the question is, what political influence do they have in Ukraine? And there, I think the answer is none, negligible. They were a sort of avant-garde on national identity. I think it is fair to say that. The ethnic nationalists in Ukraine were the most enthusiastic to go form self-defense, kind of National Guard type units. The Azov Brigade was founded by these kind of ethnic nationalists. So I think it is fair to say that. I think these were the group of people who were most enthusiastic about independence, the most militant about it, and got the ball rolling very early on in terms of self-defense against Russia. However, as this issue has grown and as the Russian aggression against Ukraine has grown, Ukraine has brought into its military the Azov Brigade. And this really bothers me when people try to say, well, the Azov Brigade has this racist history from the Azov movement. And it's like, I'm not disagreeing. I acknowledge that that's a fact, that is true, that is how the Azov Brigade got started. But today it's just part of the National Guard of Ukraine. And the people who have joined the Azov Brigade since that time have just been regular Ukrainians who want to defend their home. And I think the Azov Brigade, they're absolute heroes in my book. I'm another Jewish person who thinks the Azov Brigade are heroes. I think they defended Mariupol. I think they saved the lives of tens of thousands of people fighting to the very, very end in Mariupol. They made sure that more cities didn't fall under Russian control, that more civilians weren't killed in more cities, like the tens of thousands that were killed in Mariupol. So I don't buy it. I don't buy it. The Azov Brigade has been under a microscope for years now because of the history of their founder and all that. There's been no credible reports of racist ideology coming out. And honestly, this isn't even a very familiar thing. I talk to people in Ukraine, and it's a little bit of a head scratcher for them. It's just a normal part of the Ukrainian military at this point. And the EU has also taken that position. They say the Azov Brigade, no problem. It's just a brigade of the Ukrainian military today. The Azov movement is still banned in the EU and in other countries and is considered an extremist group. So I'm trying to draw it out. I'm trying to be fair. I'm trying to listen. I'm trying to be sensitive, but I just don't buy it. I just don't buy it. I think we can tell when countries are in the thrall of a racist nationalism that they're not shy about it. They really tell you. You see the images in the media. You see the statements from politicians. Even if the president won't say it, one or two layers underneath are usually very open about it. That's what we see in Poland and Hungary. It's what we see in Russia, that the racism is just under the surface. And I don't see that in Ukraine. I do not see that in Ukraine. And I think it's just unfair. Like, these people are suffering genocide right now. Russia is stealing their children. Russia is killing their civilians. Like, Russia is shelling cities. Russia is murdering people. They're literally murdering huge numbers of Ukrainians and trying to erase who they are as Ukrainians. And I think in that context, Ukraine has endured so much scrutiny over this issue. And I think it's just to a point where it's kind of unfair at this point.
Thanks for clarifying about the Azov Brigade. I wasn't sure, but I think I have a better idea or understanding of how to have this conversation with my friends or people around me or internet forums that I find myself in. And at the end of the day, I think that we really need to think about that this conversation does not negate or these these historical realities don't negate the present moment which we're experiencing, which is a war, unjustified war against a group of people for no reason at all, to be honest. And that could lead to the fall of the rest of the countries in Eastern Europe and Russia being in charge. If Hungary is I don't want to say horrible, but if Hungary is having issues with xenophobia now, imagine if Ukraine falls and Russia takes over Poland, Hungary. It's going to cause an even bigger problem. And our Western ideas of multiculturalism, or even like entering or trying to have these conversations with some of these nations, is going to become even more and more difficult because Russia sees whiteness as basically under attack.
Definitely. And they've been the big promoters of racism in Europe and make the situation much worse. And I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves for people who are very concerned about racism. Does supporting Ukraine bring us rather closer to an anti-racist future, or does it take us farther away? And I think the consequences of the fall of the rules-based international order, the consequences of greater Russian influence over the West and of Eastern Europe more directly, it's clear to me that this brings us much, much closer to that scary future. And this is where I don't understand some people that I talk to. Now, there's also an article in the New York Times recently about how Russian propaganda was having some success in Africa, also in Latin America. And this kind of brings us back to that point about Haiti and ethnic nationalism. We can't confuse the ethnic nationalism of a country that isn't white with human rights. And this is something I think the left struggles with sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Just because an ethnic nationalist from Latin America or from Africa likes Putin does not equate to being an anti-racist point. They're attracted in that something ugly they believe in, they see the reflection in Russia, and they're happy with that. And we should never, ever confuse the speaker with the point. And just because someone is speaking from a Global South perspective or from a Black perspective or from a Latino perspective does not mean that it's a democratic one, even if it includes discussion of common left-wing and democratic talking points like human rights.
Honestly, I think we have to keep in mind that fascism is bad for Black people just as much as it's bad for white people. And I think that whether or not there's cultural context of colonialism, it doesn't take away from the fact that anyone in the world living under an oppressive, fascist, nationalistic regime is not someone who's having a good time. And I this is back to what you're saying about the left. This is my problem with the American left as someone who comes from a Black country, is that, like, yes, there's people are inspired here by the idea of like Black nations, Black nationalism. But if we're looking at some of the things that these Black dictators have done to Haiti, those things are not nice things. Those things are not good things. And just like Mussolini was not good for Italy, Mugabe isn't good for, I forgot which, Zimbabwe. And Papa Doc was not good for Haiti. And these people are attracted to the idea of Russian propaganda because Putin is like a god in Russia, and he's doing thought control, information control. These are some of the things that they would love to be able to do if they were able to acquire the type of resources that they want. Put people who look just like them under oppressive regimes. And we can't just fall for like general okie doke because it makes us feel better about like what happened in the colonial past. I'm not trying to say what happened in the past is not important. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that we have to look for different, better human rights focused solutions, as opposed to just saying, it's kind of like a form of reverse racism, where it's like, if Black people could just have their own country, then we wouldn't have racism. It's like, no, that's
Wakanda Forever is about. That was a funny exchange me and Chris had after Wakanda Forever, and I texted her, "Oh, this is Black Zionism," and she was like, "Oh, triggered. I want to hear more though." So I think we've given a fair hearing to this idea. We've been hearing this constant chatter of racism and Nazism from doubters for a year now. And I think we've done I think we've done our best to look at Eastern Europe from an American racial perspective. Mm-hmm. But now I think we should look at Eastern Europe from a Jewish perspective. Mm-hmm. And not to one-up anyone here, but Jews are integral to Eastern European racial dynamics. And Black people just aren't. Like, I'm sorry, like it's a relevant issue today, and we can talk about global anti-Blackness and immigration, but in terms of really deep roots of thousands of years, we have to really talk about Jews in this part of the world. I think one reason I get so upset about this whole Ukraine Nazi thing is that Zelensky is Jewish. And I've made comments in other episodes where I'm like, well, he's marginally Jewish. Yeah, okay, he's marginally Jewish. He's assimilated, to use the nasty terms that we Jews use. He is absolutely an assimilated Jew. And if you think that makes any difference in Eastern Europe, you just don't understand the Eastern European racial system. It's not a colonial racial system, but it's a racial system nonetheless. And talking to Ukrainians, and I've had these conversations where I'm like, well, he's marginally Jewish, and what's the relevance, And they're like, oh no, we all know. You can see that he's Jewish. His last name's Jewish. Everybody knows that he's Jewish. And I think from an American perspective, that's a little bit strange.
Yeah.
Right? Because Ashkenazi or white Jews who aren't religious and don't go to synagogue and don't talk about it and just it's not their thing, they're not interested in it. I don't really think of such people as Jewish. They have Jewish background maybe, but they're white. That's how I think of them in the United States anyways. If someone's really Jewish and it's important to them, maybe we can have that conversation, but I'm talking someone just who has Jewish background. That's not legible in the United States. I'm sorry. That's outside any racial system. In Eastern Europe, it isn't. It isn't. And I think that's what I really want to help people who are concerned about this issue and are concerned about racism to understand is that Jews are the historic other in this part of the world. And I'm not trying to minimize the anti-Muslim refugee or global anti-Black issues that we have in places like Poland right now. They are very serious. But what I'm trying to bring out is that countries that are in the thrall of ethnic nationalism don't elect Jewish presidents. And countries that are seriously tempted by ethnic nationalism, it's like a strong minority stream of 30%, always teetering on the edge of getting power, like in the United States. They also don't pass in silence that they have a Jewish leader. It's an issue they're constantly attacking. I'm thinking about the dog whistles against Obama, for example. You would see 10x that against Zelensky, and you just do not see it. And that's kind of the issue I have, because Ukrainian nationalists have a history with Nazism in the World War II, and we can talk about it. And Jews were murdered by this regime. And today the Azov movement, which is their extremist ethnic nationalist movement, is anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic. And you don't see even an echo of that in Ukrainian politics, not the majority, and also not in the opposition. And I haven't run across it in talking to large numbers of Ukrainians, both in the United States and in Ukraine. So I want to put this one to rest. I think that there's no smoke and there's no fire. And I think if we want to talk in serious ways about racism and Ukraine, I'm going to offer two ways that I think are really credible and important ways to talk about it. One is history. So their national identity and how it draws on the history of Ukrainian nationalists, including ones who participated in the Holocaust, that's a serious problem, because once things get into your national identity, it's kind of hard to remove them. And you have arguments about dead white men and all these American history wars we've had, and Australia's had them, and Israel's had them, and on and on and on. So I think there's a very real possibility that Ukraine is going to have one of these kind of culture and history wars down the line. But hey, they're in good company. They're in good company with the most Western and democratic countries in the world. I think New Zealand nowadays ranks highest for democracy index in the world. I think New Zealand's number one now. They absolutely have this over their history of indigenous colonization and the relationship with the Maori and the Treaty of Waitangi. So go read about New Zealand racial politics. They are very real, and this is from one of the most highly regarded countries in the world. So I do think something like that is going to happen in Ukraine's future, but that's after the war. That's in a democratic Ukraine that's part of the EU, and that's in the context of Western culture wars. Also, for people who are concerned about this issue, them being in the EU is the way to best address it. I really believe in this idea of mutual stability. Even countries that are very hard to bring accountability to, like the United States, the closest thing to accountability that the United States has is really from other democratic allies. The only ones who can kind of restrain American behavior is places like Germany, places like the United Kingdom. And bringing a country that wants to be democratic into the democratic fold is the best way to advance that progress and to prevent backsliding, in my mind.
I agree. I really do.
The other side that I think is worth talking about, I don't feel like talking about right now, but that is the World War II and the Holocaust history and how it interacts with national identity. I talked a whole hour about that with Emma, and there's going to be many hours ahead, and I'm just a little tired of the subject right now. But I think we've given this a fair overview. Do you think that there are arguments you hear that still bother you and make you wonder, am I really on the right side? Should I be looking harder at Ukraine?
I think those are the two that I hear the most. I think we've covered all of the topics and subjects. Of course, if people have any other questions, we're open to questions and good faith arguments and history and bringing anything to our attention that we don't know about. We don't know everything. But I think that we have to focus on the general goal, which is to fight for democracy, to fight for people's right to self-govern. And I think that once we get to that first moral rung on the ladder, right, then we can open, like you said, we can have other conversations about, a freer society or racially diverse society, all of those things. But under Russian rule, that's not going to happen. And so we need to take a stand and even if it's a soft support to say, wear a shirt, talk to your friends, make sure that people continue to talk about the war, continue to talk about Ukraine. Russia is doing a lot of theatrics, which we'll talk about later, to make themselves out to be a victim. And so we have to keep the actual victims in mind. And we support victims. So we're on the right side.
Definitely. Okay, so it seems pretty clear this episode's going to be about race, really. We've given a lot of time and attention to the doubters. Now it's my turn. Now I want to turn this conversation back at these folks making these kinds of arguments, the ones that are making it from a place of good faith. Ukraine is a vital anti-racist cause. I don't understand how you can talk about fighting for human rights and democracy in the United States and not fight for it abroad. I don't understand that. And someone will need to explain that perspective to me. Because in Ukraine, I see a country that is fighting centuries of colonization, settler colonialism, of actually moving Russian speakers in, and an attempt to co-opt, deny, diffuse, and direct the national identity, attempts to suppress their language for centuries. I think Ukrainians are a very deeply colonized people. And I think we see with other groups that have emerged from centuries of colonialism that it takes time to find your footing, to understand what you are separately from the colonizer. And I see Ukraine breaking free of Russia as one of the great anti-colonial causes of my lifetime, of our age today, and honestly, one of the most unlikely, because they didn't have the winds of history behind their back, and they didn't have a century-long decolonization of Africa and the kind of automatic political thought patterns of like, oh yeah, definitely, I support you. No, they didn't have any of that. In fact, they had to shake off a lot of prejudice from Soviet times and just a lot of prejudice against Slavic cultures that we have in the West due to that history with the Soviet Union. And they had to make their case with the blood of protesters during the Euromaidan revolution, and now the blood of their civilians, their soldiers, their children. And I think we talked for a good long time about Ukraine from a Western racial perspective. I do want to have that conversation. If you want to email me or leave a comment on this video, making more arguments in that direction, I definitely want to hear them and we can talk more about them. But I also want you to consider that maybe Ukraine is a victim of violent, genocidal racism and colonialism from Russia. Okay, I think that much is fair. If you want me to seriously consider that the U.S. shouldn't support Ukraine because of issues around the Western racial system, I want you to seriously consider that Ukraine has been a victim of colonialism and oppressive violence in an Eastern European racial system. Because
my final thoughts are that, as we're trying to reiterate in our podcast and our discussions, is that democracy, human rights, like I have a lot of conversations with my friends outside of this Ukraine conversation that center around like the future of the planet and the future of the world. And I think that lately it's so easy to feel overwhelmed and to feel like you have no say and no stake in how the future of your family and your maybe descendants or even your future is going to end up because of how big these geopolitical conversations are, especially when in our minds, since the Soviet Union, Russia is such a big superpower. And Putin, no matter how many sometimes clownish representations that we see of him on horsebacks, bare-chested on the beach, there is the reality that everyone that I know thinks and knows that Russia is not a place that you would want to be. If you're a Westerner, it's not a place that you would want to be. So we all understand this. Maybe we don't have a lot of the history or the maybe current social context for what that is, because I didn't until you introduced me to like Russian propaganda. Like I knew it was bad, but I didn't know it was this bad. And I think that it's worse than we think, and we already think that it's bad. So if we know intuitively or from our little information about culture and historical context that what Russia is not like an easy or to be messed with situation, that we should understand the plight of the Ukrainian people, that like they are, facing the bad guy from Die Hard, right? They are in that dire situation where every little freedom that they have, the freedom of like the media they can consume, the freedom of like what their children are learning in school, all of that is being erased by this war. And we keep, Lily keeps talking about the children that are disappearing. The Russian government is kidnapping Ukrainian people's children. So
don't they deserve human rights? I mean, we're so concerned in this discourse about, well, maybe a future Ukraine won't be the most comfortable place for people of color to live or concerns like this. And I am willing to have that conversation. But what about the people being murdered today? Are we to dismiss their human rights and their interests and say, we're going to put priority 0 on that because what? Because they're European? Because they're white? That seems like a really perverse perspective.
And I think that like in the context of this war, I don't want to say race is not relevant, because as a Black person, to me, race is always relevant. But what I want to say is that, like, racial politics, as Russia would have it, if you guys just look up the racial politics of Russian propaganda in the right in the United States, if as Russia would have it, it's not going to get better. If we want it to get better, we should support Ukraine, and we should support a freer Europe. We should support a Europe with cross-cultural exchange. We should not support these ultra-right nationalist governments, because that does not help with our causes, either as leftists or liberals or whatever you want to call yourself. As somebody who supports human rights and humans' ability to, self-direct, what Russia is doing does not align with those ideals. So if you feel like there's nothing in the world you can do for the future and there's nothing you can support, this is a cause that you can rally behind that potentially has an impact to the future of the world. And so I feel like we need to empower ourselves. We need to continue to have these conversations. You can support Ukraine, and we can keep debating this topic.
Definitely. Here on this podcast, I will read your comments, and we can talk about it all the way to Ukrainian victory. It's never going to be a taboo subject in my mind, but please keep a broader perspective.
Yes, I agree. And I think that we can do two things at a time, there's also the reality that there is no perfect cause that's going to come along where the person is not sexist, is not homophobic, there's never going to be the perfect victim for us.
No.
And so we need to make a decision about where our values are, where they align, and what we can do to help move people in the direction that we want or need them to move for the future and for a better global reality for everybody.
Definitely. And I don't think we need to sacrifice one to work on the other. I'm not fighting for any free Ukraine. I'm fighting for a democratic Ukraine that respects human rights. And I feel confident that that's what most Ukrainians are fighting for as well.
Yes.
Okay, that's been quite a conversation.
I had a good time. I feel like I also need a nap and maybe a snack afterwards. But we hope that you enjoyed it and that you were able to learn a lot. I always learn a lot when we do these podcasts, and I appreciate you, Lily.
Thank you, Chris. All right, until next time, glory to the heroes and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to Ukraine, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.